Hi, Isaac. Okay, you're back? Oh, I think you're on mute. Okay.
Rabbi, good morning. It's so great to see you.
Good morning. Okay. Wow. Very exciting. We're going to talk about some false prophets today.
Mhm.
I haven't risen to the level of false prophet yet. I'm still working on that. But one day, we could rise to the level of Bob Dylan.
So, are we doing 15 and 16 or just
No,
15?
I think we're going to do 7:15 through 7:20 in one shot.
Oh, okay, that's great. Okay, let's
I know it feels overwhelming to see 6 verses in one shot, but I think, and the funny thing is also these 6 verses is they're even repeated, right? Later in Matthew, the mushal, the metaphor of good fruit, bad tree shows up. I mean, I forgot where it shows up even later in Matthew. So, so we'll have 2 chances to skim through it.
the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 7, verse 15 onwards. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will recognize them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? So every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus thus you will recognize them by their fruits.
So again, I'm wanted to point out, there does seem to be some repetitive message aside from this showing up later in Matthew. Where we see 18:19, a good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down. And then it's cut down, and we have the line 4 in 17. The same way, every good tree bears good fruit, but the bad tree bears. So it seems like 17 and 18 are very, very, very similar, to say the least. But so we'll talk about the metaphor maybe at the end. But what I really want to discuss with you today is one of the central beliefs of Judaism as it relates to Christianity. So Judaism, as you're aware, does not see in Jesus what Christianity sees in Jesus. Even Judaism does not see in Jesus what Islam sees in Jesus, right? While Islam will look at Jesus as, a prophet and say
Mhm.
some positive things about Jesus and his mother, Judaism, for the most part, has a more negative relationship, but based on not only the history of the relationship, but also based on the nature of how Jews see the Torah and the prophets. So I thought I would start by asking you, number one, is Jesus a prophet from your perspective?
Yes,
Um,
absolutely, absolutely, yes. There's no doubt of it.
Absolutely, yes, that's great. And then number two, how would you know if he's a false prophet? So, and I'll frame the question because Jesus seems to think that we can tell, right? When we read the Sermon on the Mount, which is, let's say, address the people there. Maybe he's not even talking about the Pharisees or talking about false. Like he's addressing the people on the Mount and says, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves." We don't have to say Jesus is giving us the litmus test here. It's possible he is, but we don't say this is the only way. But this is one way that he feels that you should tell. So I want, before we analyze 15 through 20 and look at the history of false prophets in both Bible traditions as well as New Testament traditions and rabbinic tradition, I'd like to ask you, like, how do you know? You could say Jesus, but if you want, you don't want to make it so close theologically to home. Like, how would you know someone's a false prophet? How do you know?
That's a very great question. It's a very good question. So you're asking, what's a litmus test to identify or to label someone or to identify someone as a false prophet or a good prophet?
Jesus is saying, "Beware of something."
Yeah, I think we can say we can never know. We can never speak in absolute terms, right? Who's good or who's bad. I think what Jesus is pointing to is certain indicators of, like there's a big focus in Matthew on bearing fruits. And this builds upon the themes we've seen earlier. He speaks about if salt, again, if you're the salt of the earth, you're the light of the world. Um, and I think, um, the way I read this is he's saying that if you don't bear good fruits, or he's trying to make this sound so drastic, is if you don't bear good fruits, you're a false prophet. It's to motivate folks to bear good fruits. Because John speaks very harsh words to the Pharisees. He calls them a brood of vipers and like very strong terms which we typically wouldn't use. And I look at this, it's building on those themes where to use these harsh words to draw to reaction, but to draw out a positive reaction. But to answer your question, I don't think we can fully know. I don't think I can fully identify to know who's a who is a good who is a false prophet to someone who is not a false prophet or a good prophet or
I'm surprised, Isaac. This is not what I would have anticipated you saying. I
okay.
think that, like, you know, I could look at people all the time and go, no way in hell, no chance. And if they say they're a prophet, I would say, if you do certain things, like so Jesus's attitude here is should know by the fruits. I don't know. I could tell you a lot of bad people who have good fruits, a lot of good people who have bad fruits.
Yeah.
If anything, I think that's the last litmus test I would use. And not only that, in Jewish tradition, for example, we say that when someone's really bad and looks like they're having a good life, a lot of times we say, oh, God is rewarding them in this world because the next world is going to smash them, and get them down. So if anything, the good fruits, it's ironic, is a sign of the bad seed. So if anything, in Judaism, at least, we'd say you can't tell by the good fruits. Good fruits are worthless. Maybe he's just taking one for the team. Maybe God's punishing him next world. Maybe he's lucky. Maybe whatever. There's 1,000 reasons.
So it sounds like you're equating good fruits with material success.
No, I don't know. Maybe he set up an orphanage and on his deathbed, he set up an orphanage and saved 10,000 kids from dropping into poverty. I don't know.
So to your point, right? Then we never know who's a good or a bad prophet. How it's like saying who's a good person or a bad person. We just don't know, right? So whether a person
how
has
can
enough,
so how can we beware? How am I supposed to beware?
I
He's
think
telling us something here. It's not
yeah,
meaningless.
I think this is more to draw a reaction from the audience. It's directed to them as in, hey, if you want to be a good prophet, you better bear good fruit. I think it's framed a different way to
Is he
draw.
telling them that one of them could be a prophet?
Um, I think so. Yes, maybe in his worldview, in his view, he would call you're all a prophet in a sense, as in bringing about the kingdom of heaven.
Wow. So number one, you're what's the right word? Dumbing down the word prophet, right? So I should have started like, what's a prophet? So generally, I'd say a prophet is a guy, a man or woman who speaks of God, whatever that means. Just like you were able to tell me what it means to talk of God in a very concise way or
Mhm.
pray. So I would say you got to talk God. What does it mean God? Whatever it means, but Judeo-Christian God. What does it mean by talk? Have some communication. So you're kind of saying prophet in the Bob Dylan sense, right? Like he says some meaningful things, he tries to correct the people, but it just doesn't seem to me that Jesus is so foolhardy or light on that. Okay, well, listen, the truth is Judaism, Christianity, the Bible, the New Testament all have lots of opinions about this. So instead of continuing pricking at you, let's look at some sources. And
Yeah, so on that note, the word prophets, could the word prophets mean beware of false leaders? So we're not so caught up
I
on,
don't think so.
you
I
don't
think
think
we have the
so.
word leader. A false leader. What's a false leader? I mean, the guy who stole power, a guy who steals king. Okay, anyway, so I want to do two sources from Deuteronomy. The main source I would say is in Deuteronomy 18, which has a whole list of like what a prophet is. I don't want to read the whole thing, but I will point out if you can read through Deuteronomy, it probably starts. Oh my God, it starts really early. At least verse 15, but some of the earlier stuff about that. So I want to skip from verse 15 and go all the way to Deuteronomy 18, 19. And it shall be that the man who will not listen to my words, that he shall speak in my name, aka some guy saying he's a prophet, speaking God's name, but he's not saying what God said them say, I will exact from him. But the prophet who willfully shall speak a word in my name, that will have not that which I have not commanded him to speak, or who shall speak in the name of gods of others, that prophet will die. So Judaism is very clear. False prophet dead. Execute false prophets. Okay, so this only begs the question though. It just says he says something that God didn't say, or it leads you astray. So leading you astray is pretty easy. So this prophet says, go worship idolatry. Okay, so that was like really said. God couldn't have said that according to Deuteronomy. But what about the idea of he says, God says that you should all jump up and down twice a day on Wednesdays? I don't know. See, God could have said that. We know with some of the prophets where God did say some things that were jarring and surprising. When he tells a prophet, like walk around naked or to marry a prostitute. Like God does say some jarring things in the prophets. Okay, so the other source. So if we left it there, I don't think we would be able to have a good understanding. But also, when we go to Deuteronomy, go to chapter 13, which way? Okay, chapter 13, verse 2 to 4. I'm just going to read it to you. If there arises in the midst of you a prophet or a dreamer of dreams, and he gives you a sign or wonder, aka does something magical, miraculous, amazing, something that does not run of the mill, and the sign or the wonder came to pass. He goes, this is going to happen, and it happens. Whereof he spoke to you, saying, let us go after other gods, just like in Deuteronomy later, where it says, if you go after gods, which you'll know, let us serve them. You'll know to not listen to him. You say serve other gods, automatically bad. Or unto the dreamer of dreams, for the Lord who God puts you proof to know whether you do love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. Okay, so over here again, we have a weird litmus test. It's unclear. How do you know if someone is a false prophet? Not only that, in the book of Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah 28, we have in verses I guess between 1 and 11, we have a situation where we have Hananiah the son of Azor the prophet, and it calls someone a prophet who literally it holds, the guy's not a prophet. So in other words, a false prophet is still a prophet, but a false one. So you even have like this weird category of like false prophet equals a type of prophet.
So it sounds like in this case he's being subversive in the sense that this one flips us. It flips the litmus test from it's not so much what you say, but it's the conduct of the individual prophet, as in what types of life does a prophet live? Does a prophet live a life which exhibits a kingdom? And in that sense, I think he flips. It sounds like he's being subversive in changing the definition of what is or who is a prophet, or what qualifies a prophet to be a false prophet. It's not so much of what they do, it's not so much of what they say, but how do they conduct their lives?
Well, I don't know. You'll know them by their fruits. So you're saying fruits are psychological. Like, I don't know. Generally, I feel like I wouldn't use it as psychological. Fruits is what comes about because of them. I would use fruits. That's what it means in English for sure today. Are grapes gathered from thorns? So are the good grapes coming, the good product, the good consequence coming from the bad thing or not? So again, like I hear you're saying it's psychological, but I would not read it that way. I would read it that let's look around at his followers. Let's look around at all those things, and are good or bad things happening? Okay, but let me go back before we even jump to that. There's actually a really interesting Sifra, which is a rabbinic midrash writing. I'll just read it to you. And the sign shall come to pass. Rav Yose the Galilean said, see how far the verse goes to meet the intentions of the idolaters and grant them dominion. Even if the false prophet halts the sun, literally does a miracle that is one of the most miraculous things we can imagine, stopping the sun, stopping the moon, stopping the stars, stopping the constellations in their courses, you should not listen to them. So for the Lord your God putteth you to proof, you to know your love. So over here, again, I don't know if the right word is subversive, but clearly Jesus is not saying thing as Rav Yose. Rav Yose the Galilean, who's a little bit later than Jesus, but close, 2nd century rabbi. So he says that even if the guy does amazing things, I don't know if you want to call it good fruits, but he does amazing things, stops the sun in its path, miracles that you can't imagine, you still shouldn't listen to them. That's just God testing you. God tests you sometimes. That's how God does. That's how God gods. And if God's in a way that tests you and does miraculous things, that's just a mess of you. And that's fine. That's how God runs the world, Rabbi Yossi saying.
Yeah, so Rabbi, I'm still not fully following. So in this case, Jesus would tell the Pharisees who came to John the Baptist that they were false prophets, right? Just based on how.
Well, I don't know. Like you're throwing around the word false prophet. Why? I don't see Jesus ever using the word prophet the way you're saying prophet.
Oh, fair enough. So John the Baptist called them that, right? John the Baptist called them brutal. Why he has some very harsh words for them in Matthew. I think
right,
Matthew,
but we're focusing on the word prophet, though, right?
Prophets, right? Yeah. So now, wouldn't they be prophets? The Pharisees of his time, wouldn't they be?
Absolutely not. There's no way the Pharisees would call themselves prophets. They would call themselves, rabbis, Pharisees, people who represent God. But again, like at least in Judaism, the word prophet has a very strong connotation because Deuteronomy talks about prophets all the time. And like for example, when I say the word Samuel in Hebrew, I don't say the word Samuel. I say Shmuel Hanavi, Samuel the prophet. And just like, I feel Muslims do this the best, right? They'll be like, they'll say like, the person's name and then like kind of their title and peace be unto them. So that's kind of like the Muslims. So Jews usually don't do that. Jews have like Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our rabbi, but for the most part, prophet, no one's called a prophet unless you're a prophet. Not only that, Judaism holds, at least rabbinic Judaism holds, that prophecy ceased when the canon was closed. If someone claims, at least like the way rabbinic Judaism holds today, that if you're a prophet in the first century, inherently that you can't be, because prophecy ceased. And that's why if a Jew came today and said, I'm a prophet, we would discount him. It's actually a complicated matter. How can you even like have a Messiah thing according to Jews today, a Messiah person, individual, if we don't trust prophecy? So much, Isaac, I'll even throw it at you. If a person came today and he said, I'm not a Isaac metaphor prophet, I am not a Bob Dylan prophet, but I am a legit prophet. I speak to God. You know what we do to him? Probably lock him up, put him in an insane asylum. What happens if he said, I'm a prophet from God and I say you have to jump on Wednesday twice in the air? You would say, you're crazy. Why would I listen to you?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say within Christianity there are people who call themselves prophets even today. It's very common within the Christian, certain parts of Christianity where folks will identify themselves as prophets. So I don't think Christianity has that strong.
But do they mean prophet in that God's speaking to them or God's directing their life?
You know,
The big difference, though. I'm saying prophet
Yeah.
has that formal definition.
Yeah. Some of them I think would claim that God speaks to them, right? Some might claim that God speaks to them, and now do they really speak to them? I really don't know. Maybe they would be they could qualify as a false prophet, but this idea of still being prophets, it's still common.
Well, like I said, like in Jewish tradition, like you don't have anything like this. A prophet speaks to God, and what Rabbi Yossi, I didn't say Rabbi Akiva side, what Rabbi Yossi the Galilean says, even if they do miracles, which would I feel today would be the proof.
Yeah.
If you had a guy say do crazy things, and then he says, I'm literally going to stop the sun in the sky, and you could have every single guy in the world who's a magician watch, and he'll do something that's unexplainable in a way that he could explain it, we would believe. If anything, this is one of the questions I think that like some religious folk have. How come God doesn't intervene in the way that makes him more believable? I feel like a lot of the atheists and Penn and Teller, even when they talk, they say like anyone who could show us something that's real magic, we'll give them $1 million. So Rabbi Akiva says, heaven forbid, God forbid that the Holy One, blessed be he, should halt the sun, the moon, the stars, the constellation for the sake of the idol worshippers. There's no such thing as a test like that. And if anything, this is one of the things that came down to the world today about like, how do you know when someone's a false prophet? A lot of times Judaism is framed because of Christianity, but I just want to read you 2 more lines from Maimonides. Maimonides in the Foundations of the Torah, chapter 8 says, every prophet who will rise after Moses, our teacher, we may not believe in him on the strength of a sign alone, that we would say, if the sign comes to pass, we will listen to you. On the contrary, is on the strength of the commandments which Moses commanded in the Torah, and said, a prophet with will the Lord your God raise up to you from the midst of thee, just as commanded us to reach a verdict on the strength of witnesses, even though we do not know whether they have testified truth or not. So too he commanded us to listen to the prophet, even though we do not know whether the sign he gave is true or not, or more is trickery or sorcery. So Maimonides has like another level where he says you listen to the prophet on the strength of what he's saying until otherwise stated. We have certain rules, and if he breaks it, therefore a prophet should arise in you and perform signs and great miracles and endeavor to contradict the prophecy of Moses, we may not listen to him. And we may not make sure that those signs are performed through trickery or sorcery. For the prophecy of Moses, our teacher, is not authenticated by signs that we may array one sign after another, but we behold it with our own eye, blah, blah. So what's interesting is that you have Maimonides, it could be this is a polemic against Christianity, but it's definitely in the Talmud as well, that we don't care if you did sign. Let's imagine one of the reasons that Judaism would reject Jesus, let's imagine he fed lots of people through a miracle. Let's imagine he turned wine from water. Let's imagine he did other miracles. If the conclusion is that someone is trying to have we haven't used the word in a while, antinomian approach to commandments.
Antinomian,
Yeah, or if the person is trying to have an approach that even undermines one commandment, you would know that prophet is not real. And again, like I'm not here to tell you what Jesus said, because the way that Jesus is understood in subsequent centuries is not necessarily what he said. Obviously from the very quantity of Christian denominations, we see it's probably complicated to try to figure out exactly what it is that Jesus said. But Judaism's approach, as understood through Maimonides, as understood through Rabbi Akiva, is that if a prophet has you not only worshiping other gods, but trying to undermine the prophecy of Moses, then it's not a prophet. And it's really interesting. One of the problems that at least the three Abrahamic religions have is that each one says they're final, right? Judaism says there's no more prophet after Moses. Jesus says, I'm God, and you can't have another God. And then Islam says, oh, you can't have another one. And then the problem is when you're final, you kind of saying everyone else is wrong. And you have this approach where this is the way it has to be. So Judaism inherently rejects other prophets because it undermines the message of Moses. The last verse in the Bible, how it talks about how no prophet will rise again like Moses. Well, you could argue about the grammar about it, like what does it mean that no prophet will rise? Maybe no prophet did rise or whatever. But we do see that this idea that Judaism rejects the idea of another prophet. And if they're speaking to God in a way that shows them to undermine the religion, then they're not really speaking to God. So I think what's interesting about Jesus, I want to go back to just because like we want, we could definitely go through more sources in the prophets and to show you more Christian sources, maybe we will. But when you look at Jesus, it's really hard to understand what he's trying to say. Because when he says, beware of false prophets, I'm just not sure how people will be able to differentiate what he's saying from the more than handful of other false prophets that he would have identified as a false prophet floating through Galilee, floating through Judea in the first century. And when he gives us one piece of advice, I view this piece of advice as a very difficult litmus test. Especially they come to you in sheep's clothing. Like, how much are you really going to investigate them? How are you going to you'll know them by their fruits. All these things I think are very, very complicated. And if anything, like you tried to explain this at the start, saying like there's an ambiguity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he does that on purpose, maybe. But I think unless you say something that it's very difficult to know what practical message you could get from this. It's hard.
I still think so. So I look at this not so much as in qualifying who is a false prophet, but I like to think about this a bit, I know, because to your point, a prophet is it's an elevated job. It's the much higher place than the average than typical person, and so yeah, I don't have a good reason.
So if we didn't have any other verses from Matthew or Luke or other places, I would agree with you. But let me just read you first one quote from Jeremiah, and then one from Matthew, one from Luke. Jeremiah 14:14. Then Lord said, the prophets are prophesying lies in my name. I have not yet sent them or appointed them or spoken to them. They are prophesying to you false visions, divinations, idolatry, delusions of their mind. So we have Jeremiah calling out false prophets. And then we have Matthew 24:24. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. So we keep having this idea that false prophets are something that you have to worry about. So I'm not sure what you can do about this in reality, where to be able to differentiate. Again, we have a quote from 2 Peter, we have a quote from 2 Timothy. I mean, I'll just use one last one because we never quote John so often. So 1 John 4, 1-6. Dear friends, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. It's very like false prophets, totally not good. This is how you recognize the spirit of God. Every spirit that acknowledges that Jesus Christ has come into the flesh is from God. So that's a very John thing to say. I get that. But and it's a very different litmus test than we say in Matthew. But we see as Christianity develops past the year 50, we see different litmus tests, which are much more strict than Jesus. So again, I think like in conclusion, like to look at Jesus, what he's saying, I think if you want to go the subversive route and say similar to what you said from the start, Jesus doesn't care if you're a prophet or not. He's just not interested. A person who claims they're a prophet and speaks to God is a meaningless thing. One thing that Yeshai Leibowitz used to always say, one of my favorite things, that there's no greater what's the exact words he said? One of the greatest misadventures or biggest failures in Judaism is that of the prophets. That no prophet ever made people more religious. They yelled at people, they tried, and aside from maybe Jonah, it's been a very failed venture as a historical entity. And that really hits religious people hard, because a lot of times we look at prophets as the people who are the most religious and accomplishing so much. But Eliyahu, Elijah the prophet, was a very angry man at the end of the day, because he wasn't able to probably convince people of what he wanted to accomplish. So if you wanted to go your route, Isaac, and learn this as, when I say false prophets are forms of prophets, but what he really means is like, don't worry if someone's a prophet, only judge people by their fruits. And again, while this does, again, like the problem with that read, it does seem to contradict um
That
uh
doesn't that sounds more
Matthew
plausible,
24,
right?
24. But
This sounds more plausible. What it's saying is, do again, the office of prophet does not mean anything unless what matters is your conduct and your behavior. And probably Paul builds upon that to much to a greater level. But that wouldn't you say fits with his broader themes of the Matthew's focus is on conduct, on behavior, on being the salt of the world, the light of the world.
yeah, so I think you have this narrative section that, well, I guess another way to say what you're saying, what looks like legality to a Jew will be understood as a narrative to a Christian. You know, I
I
think
like the
that
way you
that like
framed it. I like the way you framed it. What looks like legality to a Jew would come across as a narrative to a Christian.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that's maybe one. You know, I just want to before we finish, I just want to point out because we don't I didn't we're not really going too much into depth in the fruit metaphors, but I do want to look at 19. I think 19 is a little problematic because the metaphor is very difficult to not be militant. So it says every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. If it just said cut down, I'd be like, okay, cut down bad trees. But thrown into a fire, I think like we still do see this harsh rhetoric of this very strong, like it's the kingdom of heaven or nothing. And I think sometimes we have this preaching towards going on the right path until you get there, or maybe the never ending path. But suddenly when you see this metaphor, it says thrown into a fire. It's not saying cut down means like it has to end. Thrown into fire means it has to be destroyed. And that kind of metaphor, I feel like doesn't really fit with the rest of Matthew 7:15 through 20. And I feel even if you cut out 7:19 and just read 18 to 20, a good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Thus, you will know them by the fruits. I think that's like a better read. And I feel like 19 is a harshness that doesn't seem to be native or indicative of this metaphor. And because the metaphor is so repetitive, and this one line is not repetitive, I wouldn't be surprised if there's 7:16 and 17 are one metaphor and 18 and 19 are a separate one, and they were put together, some form of that. I do find 19 to be like out of sync with 18, with 20, with 17. And what's interesting though is we do have kind of two metaphors existing at once here though, right? We have the sheep in the wolf's clothing, namely like it looks like a good tree, it's trying to do good things. So if anything, sheep is better than a good tree. Trees are still trees. You can't tell when you look at them if they're good or bad. You have to wait for their fruit. But a sheep in wolf's clothing is someone who's trying to fool you. So I think like this metaphor, or at least like the sheep in wolf's clothing metaphor, exists at a more kind of actively deceiving you level. While the fruit one, it's deceiving you, but not like actively. It's just the nature of it to deceive. You can't tell when you look at a non-fruit bearing tree. Um, but
Yeah. Thank you for highlighting verse 19, right? It's very harsh. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. So to your point, it's not just being cut down, but he's saying it will be destroyed. It's either all or nothing. What are your thoughts on the sheep and the wolves, right? That's also do you have any thoughts on that? On this on comparing on contrasting a sheep's clothing inwardly they have sheep's clothing, but are ravenous wolves.
So again, I don't feel it is like exactly fits with the metaphor of the fruits. It does seem that the idea of a false prophet, if it's literally a prophet, is someone who's trying to fool you, is trying to get some like let's imagine I'm trying to claim to be a false prophet. There must be some egotistical, psychological, financial benefit that I'm reaping from that deception. So I feel like this, it does seem he wants you to know there are people who are trying to lead you positively or trying to lead you but fail. And it could be, it's interesting. What about a false prophet who tells you to do good things and he has good fruits? It seems to be here. Let's say a false prophet tells you, Judaism told you to give 10% of your salary to charity. I'm saying give 11%. That's the only message he ever says. So if he or she says that kind of message, it does seem like it's like a sheep's kind of message. It's a positive thing, and it's hard to imagine how these people should be viewed as ravenous wolves, which is a very, very harsh kind of thing. So again, it's not clear to me exactly.
And so if you look at verse 20, it says, "Thus you'll recognize them by their fruit." So then, which then to me says, um, that every tree which does not have good fruit is cut down and thrown into fire. And he's saying, because you throw it in the fire, only then you'll recognize them by their fruits. Or do you see, how again? Do you see connections between 19 and 20?
Yeah, again, like I think like 20 could be read after. You could have read 20 after 16, 17, 18, or 19. It's a little conclusionary, right? Um, yeah, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure what each one adds, but yeah, this is a very interesting metaphor to talk about sheep's and
So,
wolves. Yeah.
so this topic of being all or nothing thrown into fire, was it common language in that time?
Well, again, this is a metaphor. It's the way I'm reading it. You could argue that, like,
John
cut
the
it a
Baptist,
dark way. What are you going to do with a tree when you cut it down, though? Like,
yeah,
you got to burn it.
John the Baptist also had very harsh words, very again even much more harsh than Jesus. And so, was this just typical like this type of language in that time? Was it? I know right now we probably much more milder. We don't want to say things which are offense. We are very careful in kind of what's being said. Was this type of language just common in that at that time?
I'm not sure. I mean, it seems that Jesus goes on and off between harsh and not harsh, but it's unclear. Oh, unclear. Okay, Isaac, I think we'll call it a day. Yeah, we're getting there.
Rabbi, on that note, thank you.
Okay. Thanks.